Kevin, good to have you on the program. So what are the top three expectations that you have on tax policy later this week? What are the things that Ukur Yatani needs to do before he leaves office?
Thank you, Ramah, for having me. We are looking at a budget that will be read in an interesting time, where we are looking at economic recovery post-COVID, but at the same time, we are also faced with challenges from a geopolitical perspective. We have the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So what we expect from a tax side in this budget is we expect an ease in the cost of living. We are looking at lowering maybe the taxes on essential commodities for food commodities, and at the same time agricultural inputs that are used to produce the food commodities. We're also looking at maybe easing the taxes on the petroleum and the LPG products. We are all aware of what is happening in the past few weeks. There's been a fuel shortage, which is affecting so many sectors of the economy. And at the same time, maybe the third thing that we'd expect the CS Treasury in his budget policy statement, especially from a tax perspective, is the much awaited National Tax Policy Framework, which he highlighted in his prior budget in 2021. So we expect to see an implementation of the National Tax Policy Framework, which would create much certainty from a tax perspective.
But let me just push back a little bit on that, because last quarter, Q4 2021, we actually did have legislators going to the floor of the House, introducing a private member's bill, I believe, that would try and cut taxes applied on petrol. So yes, we're all facing a big inflation crunch at the moment, and that would have been an easy win, even politically speaking, for the current government to essentially try and pull off. But back then, Treasury said, no, we're actually opposed to any tax cuts on fuel. Why would that situation have changed now in April?
We can all see what is happening in from a global perspective, and oil prices are increasing steadily, especially due to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Maybe at that time when that proposal was being tabled in Parliament, we didn't have the perspective that we are faced with right now. So I think it's time to rethink that proposal and cushion Kenyans from the effects of increasing oil prices from a global perspective.
Okay, so private consumption, key driver of growth, at least in the medium term here in Kenya, but private sector investment contribution to growth, that has been falling fairly steadily. What tax measures do enterprises need to be able to raise more capital and invest more locally?
Ramah, one thing that investors always look out for when they want to put their money in a certain country, they will have to have certainty in terms of the tax policy framework. So we expect the government to create that certainty, because there has been so many changes from a tax perspective in the recent past that even us as tax practitioners, it becomes hard to keep track of all those changes that have happened. We also want to look at policies that attract investors. We have a very retrogressive policy that was introduced, or a tax measure that was introduced effective 1st January 2022 on restriction of interest expense for claimability as a tax expense. So we expect maybe the Treasury or the Cabinet Secretary Treasury to relook at that, because that will scare away investors. We also look at some measures that will spur economic or encourage investors to put their money. We can look at something to do with the introduction of investment deductions that were overhauled in 2022, the Tax Laws Amendment Act. Measures that will encourage investors to put money in certain industries, especially outside the major cities. We had the investment deduction at the rate of 150% for any investments that were done outside the cities of Nairobi, Mombasa, and Kisumu. And we could see how that was being used by many to establish industries outside those municipalities. So we expect maybe something of the sort that will encourage investors to come and invest in the country.
All right, let me follow up on something that you mentioned a little earlier, the national tax policy. The finance CS, Mr. Atani, spoke about this when he was doing his last budget statement in the middle of June last year, but he hasn't delivered on it yet. So for anyone who's viewing this conversation, what should they expect from a national tax policy? What would change for businesses, for individuals who are running businesses in this part of East Africa?
Ramah, we have had so many changes from a tax perspective in the recent past, which is not good for an economy that is growing. So we expect to have a tax policy framework that provides investors and taxpayers with certainty, that provides taxpayers with consistency, and that is easy to administer for taxpayers. So a national tax policy framework would provide the three key important aspects of a tax system. And remember, at any one point, a tax system should provide taxpayers with consistency in collection, that taxpayers are able to pay the taxes as they fall due, and should be clear for taxpayers to follow and implement. So that's what we are lobbying for the National Treasury to implement the much needed tax policy framework that will provide the much needed certainty to investors and taxpayers.
Let's talk about debt for just a moment. The debt service forecast, at least for the coming fiscal year, the one that starts in July, is about 930 or so billion shillings. That's roughly just over $8 billion for the 12 months that will end in June 2023. But should we expect that number to rise even further? Because the Kenyan shilling has, of course, been depreciating gradually against the American dollar. And in past years, when the government says this is our debt service target, they've often tended to overshoot that.
Ramah, inevitably, yes, our debt levels will continue increasing. We have also seen efforts by the National Assembly to raise that debt ceiling. If you look at our composition of our debt, over 50% of our debt is composed of foreign debt, which exposes the country to any foreign shocks from a geopolitical perspective. In the recent past, we have seen a devaluation of the currency of the Kenya shilling against the USD, which has had huge effects on our debt level. And yeah, we'll expect that to continue increasing. At the same time, we always borrow to meet budget deficit. So we expect that in this year's budget, if there are any deficits that are there, they will be met through borrowing. At the same time, you'll be looking at, are we borrowing to pay any maturing loans that will be coming in the near future? And will there be a renegotiation of any maturing loans? So our debt level is one that needs to be monitored. At the same time, we expect it to increase because of the factors that we have mentioned. But the most important thing is to make sure that we keep it on check and we are not borrowing excessively, and that whatever amounts that are being borrowed are being put into the right use.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Kevin Chege, Assistant Tax Manager in the Tax Advisory Unit at PKF East Africa. Thank you for your time.